terrifying story you've never heard. Demons are real. It all started the day Ed Harland came out of the woods alone. Everyone in town knew that Ed and his buddies used to hunt out of season. But since it helped keep the deer population under control, no one ever reported them. They were discreet about it too, always heading out before dawn and not returning until after dark, out of sight, out of mind. So when Ed walked down Main Street in broad daylight, still clad in his hunting gear with his rifle slung over his shoulder, the whole town stopped and stared. He didn't speak a word to anyone. He simply strode into Abe Holly's little juke joint on the corner of Washington and Main, placed his rifle on the bar, and ordered a bottle of whiskey. Abe was nervous, but he never turned away a paying customer. Not long after, the town's sheriff calmly took a seat beside him and asked if he was all right. But Ed wasn't all right. In fact, Ed was never all right again. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his skin was pale, as if he hadn't eaten in days. His hand trembled as he lifted the bottle to his lips, fingers stained with dark patches of dried blood. "Where's your buddy Zed?" the sheriff asked. Ed leaned in close, the sour stench of whiskey heavy on his breath, and whispered, "The woods took him." Ed was arrested, suspected of murdering his hunting companions in some kind of psychotic break. The sheriff likely didn't expect to find any bodies, not in the vast pine barrens where bears and coyotes would strip the bones clean before the week was out. The incident shook the small Arkansas town, one road in, one road out, surrounded by nothing but trees. The worst they had ever seen was the occasional DUI or domestic dispute. But now they had a triple homicide, and the town was rightfully horrified. Ed had always been warm and friendly. Sure, he had skirted a few hunting regulations, but he was a good man, a family man. How could he do such a thing to his own friends? There had to be some terrible misunderstanding, an accident, or maybe even an animal attack. But in small towns, gossip spreads fast, and it's rarely kind. There were murmurs about Ed's drinking habits, the temper he hid behind his easygoing smile. Those woods could be a dark place. Maybe that darkness had finally consumed him. The next morning, the sheriff set out into the woods with a handful of deputies and some cadaver dogs, hoping to uncover the fate of the missing hunters. 3 trucks full of men armed with bloodhounds, shotguns, and enough chewing tobacco to last them days departed at dawn, determined to make the most of the daylight. The townsfolk waved them off like heroes. The widows wanted their men back, even if only to lay them to rest. A few hours later, the search party returned far earlier than expected, screeching to a halt outside the sheriff's office. The bodies hadn't been found. The sheriff dismissed reporters and concerned citizens alike, assuring them that he would contact the county for additional support. He tried to maintain his composure, but it was written all over his face. He was afraid. The townspeople were told to go about their business as usual, but those who had gone into the woods were visibly shaken. They had seen something out there, something that terrified them. When one of the local diner workers asked his father if they should leave town until things settled, his father scoffed at the idea. "It's my final year of high school," the man had said.
"One of the most important things in my education. Whatever happened in those woods was a tragedy. But we couldn't just up and leave. People had responsibilities, bills to pay, families to support."
His mother agreed, saying that those who had already left town were overreacting. After all, there was a suspect in custody. It wasn't as though someone was still lurking among the trees, waiting to claim another victim. That night, he fell asleep with his mother's reassurances echoing in his mind. She had always been so rational, so comforting in the way only a mother could be. As sleep took hold, he told himself she was right that things would return to normal soon enough. But they didn't. They got much, much worse. The following morning, Bill Howard, a reclusive pig farmer who lived a few miles down the road, was seen driving his old pickup into town. He was a man of action, rarely making social visits. The only time anyone saw him was during his monthly grocery trips. So when he pulled up outside the sheriff's office, people took notice. His expression was distraught, but it wasn't until midday that the news spread. Something had slaughtered all of his hogs. It wasn't an animal attack. There were no bite marks, no missing flesh. Instead, every single pig had been decapitated, and their heads had been stacked into a towering pile just outside their pens, a pile that stood nearly twice as tall as Bill himself. Even more unsettling, the attack had happened in total silence. Bill had always been a light sleeper. Normally, if a raccoon so much as approached his pens, the hogs would raise a racket loud enough to wake him. But that night, there hadn't been a single sound. No squealing, no struggle. He had simply woken up to find every hog he owned brutally slaughtered, their heads torn, not cut clean from their bodies. When news of Bill Howard's slaughtered hogs spread, more people began to leave town. It wasn't a mass exodus, but now and then a family could be seen loading suitcases into their car trunks, telling their children they were going on a sudden vacation. No one could blame them. A heavy sense of unease hung over the community, as if things were only going to get worse before they got better. Some, like Jackie's father, scoffed at those who left, rolling their eyes and shaking their heads. But others, like Jackie's mother, wore a different expression, one that was becoming more common among friends and neighbors.
Are you kidding me, Jackie? You too with this crap?
Jackie's father had snapped when her mother voiced her concerns. That night, their argument carried on as Jackie climbed into bed, but beneath their frustration, a deeper emotion lingered: fear. However, it wasn't until the incident at the church that true terror gripped the town. Pastor Mike had been the spiritual leader of the community for nearly 30 years. He was a steadfast presence at both joyous and sorrowful gatherings, a man who had preached the Bible to 3 generations of townsfolk. He knew them all not just by their virtues, but by their sins. He knew the adulterers, the abusers, the gamblers. The town's darkest secrets rested in the palm of his hand. Yet in all his years, he had never encountered anything that shook his faith as much as what he saw that morning when he entered the church. Inside the main hall, the large white cross that stood at the head of the congregation had been utterly desecrated. Thick webs of dried roots twisted around it, its surface scratched beyond recognition, and the face of Christ had been completely chipped away. In its place, a small W of clay had been affixed, strange eldritch symbols carved into its soft brown surface. Tangled within the roots that clung to the cross were small bones, their origin unknown. Pastor Mike and several members of his congregation spent the rest of the day cleansing the desecration and praying aloud, desperately trying to sanctify the church once more. They sang hymns, taking turns speaking passionately about the cleansing power of Christ, while a new cross was erected in place of the old one. It was an attempt to keep the town calm, but it was already too late. The exodus had truly begun. This time, however, it wasn't just trunks being loaded with suitcases full of summer clothes. It was windows being boarded up, frightened housewives bulk buying canned goods from already half-depleted grocery stores, and looters will be shot signs being hammered into front lawns. In the end, about a third of the town's population simply packed up and left. Many dismissed the panic. Jackie's father, for one, sneered at those who fled.
A bunch of superstitious rubes.
He had muttered,
Whoever messes with the church is just some punk with an overactive imagination. While this town still has a sheriff and this house still has a shotgun in it, we're not going anywhere.
So the family stayed, and they paid for it. A few days later, Jackie's parents and she sat at the kitchen table, eating dinner in a silence that had grown heavier with each passing day. Arguments had become more frequent between her mother and father, and now neither of them spoke as she absently pushed green beans around her plate. The stillness in the house was almost comforting until it was shattered by the sound of a gunshot from their neighbor's yard. "Upstairs!" her father yelled, leading them up as he retrieved a small .38 revolver from a digital lock safe. Her mother begged him not to go back downstairs, but he insisted. He had to. What followed were some of the most terrifying minutes of Jackie's life, huddled in a locked bedroom, uncertain if her father would return. Nearly 15 agonizing minutes passed before they finally heard his voice, granting them relief beyond words. When they descended, they found her father speaking with one of the neighbors, a man whose eyes were red with tears. He explained that his toddler had been playing in the backyard with their 4-year-old Labrador when the dog had suddenly started growling. Then, to their horror, it began to twitch and shake, emitting noises no dog should ever make. The neighbor had already grabbed a shotgun by the time the animal lunged at his child. His voice cracked as he recounted the moment he pulled the trigger, and later as he and his wife cried while digging a grave for the pet they had loved. But as he continued, something changed in his expression. The grief in his eyes gave way to something else, something darker. In a low voice, he admitted that he wasn't a veterinarian, but he knew what the insides of an animal were supposed to look like. He had nearly torn the Labrador in half with 2 blasts of buckshot, yet when he saw what lay inside, it looked all wrong. It looked sick. Jackie's father went over to help bury the dog, but he was back within minutes. "The neighbors are staying here tonight," he announced upon his return. Jackie's mother, visibly on edge, simply nodded.
Okay. But what happened over there? Did you help bury the dog?
Threw a tarp over it. No one's touching that thing. We're disinfecting the whole lot, and we're calling the sheriff.
As he spoke, Jackie saw something in her father's expression she had never seen before. Fear. Then he turned to her.
Alex, go help Mr. and Mrs. Perry with their bags.
Bags? Are we leaving?
Maybe. I need to talk to Mr. Perry first, but I'm coming around to the idea.
Oh, thank God. Jackie started toward the front door to help the neighbors, but her father stopped her.
I mean it, boy. Don't go near that tarp in their backyard.
A shiver ran down her spine. What the hell happened, Dad? What did you see?
I don't know. It was a real mess out there. But you know when there's an earthquake or a hurricane, animals always sense it first. Have you ever heard that?
Yeah, I've heard that.
Look outside. Birds should be chirping their feathery little butts off. But listen, just listen.
There was nothing, not a single note of birdsong. What are you saying, Dad? Jackie asked. Her father sighed.
I'm saying, pack a bag, just in case.
As the sun dipped below the horizon, the Perrys settled into the spare bedroom. Kate and David had only lived in the neighborhood for about 6 months, along with their 3-year-old daughter. After putting the child to bed, Jackie's mother poured them glass after glass of white wine, hoping to soothe their nerves. But the conversation didn't stay lighthearted for long. Soon, it turned to everything that had been happening in town over the past few weeks. We moved here because we heard it was quiet, Kate admitted. If you can believe that. David nodded.
The murders out in the woods didn't scare us too much. I know that sounds awful, but we used to live in Little Rock.
But the whole thing with the pig farm and what happened at the church?
Kate trailed off. David muttered,
Who the hell would do something like that?
At first, we thought it was just kids messing around with Farmer Howard.
Jackie's mother said.
Went a little too far, sure, killing all those hogs. But then the church.
She hesitated. David said,
Seems almost satanic.
Don't go saying those things.
Kate gently scolded her husband, a sliver of fear in her voice.
I know. I'm sorry. Maybe this is a little melodramatic, but somehow the murders, the hogs, and the church all seem connected.
Jackie's mother finished speaking just as her father walked in, cell phone in hand. All right, just got off the phone with the sheriff, he announced, his voice carrying a somber tone. He said he'd stop by in the morning with the forest ranger to take care of it. Did you ask him about leaving town, honey? Jackie's mother inquired. About that, he began, as everyone listened intently. He said he didn't think it had come to that just yet. They're still waiting on those extra deputies to help out. But I asked him if he'd been in touch with any of the families that have already left. There was a pause before he continued. He was real coy about it. When I pressed him, he said he might have missed a call or two from them, but I don't think he's heard back from any of them. As Jackie's mother attempted to contact some of the families who had already left, their neighbor stood up, announcing his intention to retrieve a shotgun from his abandoned home. Moments later, confusion spread across Jackie's mother's face as she stared at her phone. Disconnected? She muttered, holding out the device for the others to see. But even before that, the faint beeping of a dead number was already audible. Guys, you should come hear this," the neighbor called out anxiously from the open front door. They all rose from their seats, joining him at the threshold. As Jackie moved closer, a strange sound reached her ears, a low, scratchy, whining noise. She focused, trying to determine its source. It was a discordant groaning, a scraping sound drifting from the woods behind their houses. It was the sound of some ragged old bow being dragged across rusty, tuneless strings. It was the sound of a violin. "What in the world?" someone muttered. "Get in the house," Jackie's father murmured, his voice tense. Then, more urgently, he growled, "Get back in the goddamn house, Alex!" By the time Jackie's father had his revolver drawn, everyone was already filing back indoors, retreating to safety as he pointed the weapon into the darkness. For hours, the violin continued its eerie drone. The mothers and children, Jackie included, made their way upstairs, attempting to rest while the men remained downstairs in the TV room, their firearms always within reach. But sleep proved nearly impossible. No matter how hard they tried, that wretched screeching still echoed through the trees outside. Somehow, at some point, Jackie must have drifted off, because the next thing she remembered was her father shaking her awake.
Alex, wake up!
Through tired, unfocused eyes, she noticed a bright red light spilling into the room.
Don't make a sound, but you have to get up for me, buddy.
Her father whispered urgently. Jackie sat up with a start, hurriedly throwing on her sneakers. Where the hell is that red light coming from? Before she could finish, her father thrust something into her hands. It was the wooden bat she'd used in Little League. "Take this," he ordered. "But why?" she asked. His response sent a chill through her. Something's outside. According to her father, he and David had been keeping watch when the violin finally ceased. But no sooner had it stopped than the entire house became bathed in that unnatural red glow. That was when they heard something shuffling in the grass outside. Jackie heard it too. As the three of them stood in tense silence, the slow, deliberate movements of whatever lurked outside became more pronounced. It crept around the edge of the house, lumbering ever closer to the front yard. "Do we say something?" David whispered anxiously. "No. Stay quiet," Jackie's father hissed in response. With unsteady hands, the men followed the unseen presence with the barrels of their weapons as it moved toward the front door. Then, through the frosted glass of a small panel window, they saw it. A vague, hunched shape hobbling into view.
What the hell? Who is that? Dave! Dad! Rack the shotgun!
"What?"
Rack the goddamn shotgun!
David obeyed, the mechanical click of the weapon echoing like a thunderclap in the sinister red glow. Jackie's father barked, leveling his revolver at the door frame.
We're locked and loaded in here. Now get off my property before somebody gets hurt.
On the other side of the door, the shape appeared. Jackie's father turned to her. "Jackie, call the sheriff," he said, trying to sound as calm as possible. She pulled out her phone, hammering 911 into the touchscreen. The line was busy. She hung up and tried again, still busy. "Dad, I can't get through." "Try mine," he said, tossing the phone from his pocket. "It's got his cell." She frantically searched the phone's contacts before finding the number, bringing the handset to her ear as it dialed. "The number you have dialed is not in service. Please hang up." "Damn it." Her hushed curse was all the indication her father needed. "Just try it again, girl. Take your time." She did, but over the looping metallic tone, she heard something that made her nearly jump out of her skin. The shape outside was pounding on the door. "Oh, God!" their neighbor whimpered, the shotgun trembling in his grip. "You break in here and we will shoot you." Another smash against the door made them all flinch. "Okay, David," Jackie's father said, his voice trembling as he tried to remain composed. "If they break in here, you shoot until they're not moving anymore. You got it?" I got it." The sanguine glow outside seemed to grow in intensity for a moment, almost buzzing, as the hammering reached its peak. The door was shaking with every impact now, like it might crumble away at any moment. Through the den, they could hear their neighbor's infant girl wailing in distress. Get the hell away from the door or we will shoot! Jackie's father barked as the shape on the other side hurled itself against the door. Suddenly, it stopped. The battering ceased as the red glow faded into darkness. They all stood there for a few moments in the pitch darkness, wondering if it was really over. The only sound was the wails of the baby upstairs. Where did it go? The neighbor finally whispered. I don't know, Jackie's father replied. Should we check? No, we're not going out there, he said, lowering his weapon. Go see your kid. I'll keep watch down here with Jackie. They watched as a very shaken David placed his shotgun on the TV room's coffee table before heading upstairs to console his crying child. Here, Jackie's father said solemnly, give me a hand with this couch. As they slid the large three-seater up against the front door, Jackie turned to her father and asked what he thought was going on. Jackie's father tried to reassure her, though uncertainty lingered in his voice. Look, I don't know exactly what's going on, but the cops are going to catch whoever's behind this. Everything is going to be fine, but for whatever reason, things aren't safe here right now. Jackie pressed him for answers. Then what are we going to do? We can't do anything until daylight. Her father hesitated before responding. I could go talk to the sheriff in the morning, but something tells me a lot of other people are going to have the same idea. Want me to try again? You could try, Jackie admitted, but don't expect an answer. I get the feeling we're not the only ones who got a visit tonight. You should check on Mom. Maybe try to get some sleep if you can. Her father nodded. I'll be fine, he assured her, as if finishing her thought. Now go check on your mother. As it turned out, their house wasn't the only one targeted that night. By dawn, news of the disturbances had spread, prompting the sheriff to organize a town meeting. Within an hour, nearly 100 frightened residents gathered inside the recently re-sanctified church, desperate for answers. Frustration erupted from the crowd. What the hell tried to break into our homes last night, Sheriff? Someone shouted. Where were you? We were calling all goddamn night. The sheriff stood silent for a long moment, his exhaustion plain on his face. The past few weeks had aged him, as if he had carried the town's collective fear on his shoulders. When he finally spoke, the room fell quiet. I know you're all deeply concerned, he began, and I know some of you have questions that I just don't have answers to. The only thing I can do is tell you what I know. The church was so still, one could hear a pin drop. Almost a week ago, I requested additional deputies to help us find the missing hunters. The county assured me they were on their way. He paused. But those deputies never made it here, and the county hasn't been able to reach them since. A murmur spread through the crowd. As for the families who left town in the past few days, I haven't been able to get in touch with a single one. Their phones are disconnected. Relatives haven't heard from them. It's like they just disappeared. The uneasy whispers grew louder. The sheriff exhaled, his voice wavering as he continued. I don't know who's been tormenting this town. I don't know who attacked your homes last night, and I'm sorry I wasn't there to do more. His gaze swept across the room, his tone heavy with the weight of his words. But what I can do is organize a voluntary mass evacuation starting first thing tomorrow morning. The urgency in the town meeting escalated as someone shouted, We can't wait that long, Sheriff! Panic rippled through the gathered townsfolk, spreading like wildfire. The sheriff raised his hands in an attempt to calm them. People, we've lasted this long. We can last one more night. As far as I know, no one was hurt last night, were they? His gaze swept across the room, searching for confirmation. Silence followed. See? It could be that whatever's doing this is just trying to scare us. But at this point, quite frankly, I don't want to take that chance. A voice suddenly called out from the crowd. So where are the McTells? The sheriff exchanged a glance with one of his deputies, who leaned in to whisper something in his ear. Straightening up, he responded, I believe the McTells left town a couple of nights ago. Nah, Sheriff. I saw Ted in his driveway just yesterday evening. They're here. All right. Another voice contradicted. The baby-faced deputy hesitated before speaking, his voice laced with unease. I called their house this morning. No one answered. I figured they just got up and left. A group of men near the back abruptly rose from their chairs and rushed out of the meeting hall, their footsteps echoing in the tense silence. The rest of the crowd quickly followed, drawn by the sound of revving engines and screeching tires as trucks sped toward the McTell house. The house wasn't far, just a few blocks away, and those capable of running pushed forward, following the trail of fresh tire tracks. By the time they arrived, the front door had already been kicked in, and the search was well underway. A man stumbled out of the house, his face ashen, before doubling over and vomiting onto the lawn. Another man joined him, tears welling in his eyes as he attempted to comfort his shaken friend. Among the onlookers, Jackie felt an inexplicable pull toward the house, her feet moving instinctively. But before she could get far, her father's firm hand pressed against her chest, stopping her in place. He silently shook his head, his gaze fixed on something in one of the upper windows. It was a child's room, the wallpaper adorned with bright, goofy cartoon characters. But the detail that sent chills down his spine was the single bloody handprint smeared across the window pane. The McTells were dead. Ted's lifeless body lay sprawled in the doorway of his child's bedroom, his eyes clouded over in an eerie milky white. Inside, his wife's corpse clung tightly to their toddler in a final, desperate embrace. Both bodies bore unmistakable signs of being eaten. No one needed any more convincing. The exodus had begun. Less than 2 hours later, Main Street was lined with vehicles, cars, and trucks packed with people and belongings, forming a desperate convoy of terrified townsfolk. At the front of the procession sat the sheriff's Escalade, surrounded by a huddle of armed men. The sheriff paced up and down the line of cars, informing everyone that they would wait a little longer for any stragglers. But with the afternoon waning, the nervous energy among the townspeople only grew. Thankfully, they didn't have to wait much longer. At the sheriff's signal, his men let out whistles and shouts, scrambling into their vehicles and firing up their engines. The convoy lurched forward, beginning its escape from the town. As Jackie gazed out of the car window at the place she had called home for the past 19 years, a deep uncertainty settled over her. Would she ever see it again? Only as they drove out of town did they begin to notice just how different the woods had become. The forest had become grotesquely overgrown. The bark of the now mammoth trees was cracked and warped, strained by their unnaturally rapid growth. A thick canopy of leaves and twisted branches had formed overhead, plunging everything beneath into an eerie shadow. Inside the car, a mother and daughter peered out of the windows, their expressions filled with unease as they took in the terrifying transformation of the landscape, while the father struggled to keep his eyes on the road. For a while, the convoy moved smoothly, but after a few miles, it began to slow to a crawl. Tension thickened inside the vehicle as they waited to understand the cause of the delay. As they drew closer, the reason became disturbingly clear. The road had been torn apart in places, rendered nearly impassable. Gigantic roots had burst through the concrete, their woody tendrils twisting unnaturally across the pavement. The convoy was forced into a slow, cautious slalom, swerving left and right to navigate through the grotesque obstacles. But before long, the vehicles ground to a halt once again. Frustration crept into the father's voice. "What the hell is it this time? Come on, get moving!" he muttered, but no one moved. Instead, doors creaked open as people hesitantly stepped out of their cars. Reluctantly, the family joined them, walking toward the side of the road to get a better view. What they saw froze them in place. A long line of abandoned cars stretched ahead, eerily similar to their own convoy. But the true horror came in the realization of where those cars had come from. The vehicles belonged to the people who had tried to leave town in the preceding weeks. And now, they sat there, empty. "Jesus Christ, what happened to them?" someone whispered in horror. "Keep calm, people," the sheriff called out, his voice attempting to steady the rising panic. "We're going to find ourselves a way through." One of the armed escorts stepped forward, hauling a chainsaw from the back of his truck. The small, tinny engine roared to life, its sharp growl cutting through the tense silence. Others retrieved axes, knives, and hatchets, preparing to hack away at the massive trees blocking the road. No one dared to voice the obvious question: How had these trees managed to grow so quickly? How had a clear road just days ago now become utterly impassable? The truth was too unsettling to contemplate. What was happening was impossible. A sudden gasp interrupted the thought. "Oh my God!" The mother's voice cut through the heavy air as she pointed toward the side of the road. Her eyes were wide with horror. At the base of one of the enormous gnarled pine trees, something black and festering pulsed in the dim light. A strange, glistening fungus covered the bark, its surface shifting in an unnatural, almost sentient motion. Eyes locked onto the grotesque sight, no one immediately noticed when a man behind them suddenly collapsed onto the pavement. A startled cry escaped from his wife as she fell to her knees beside him. Others rushed forward, calling his name, but their voices were drowned in rising panic. Blood began to pool beneath his head, dark and thick against the cracked asphalt. Something had fractured the back of his skull. Then they appeared. The creatures tore through the trees on either side of the convoy, ashen-skinned figures with horns protruding from tangled hair, howling as they charged. Anyone armed immediately opened fire as the gray horde came stampeding toward them, but the attackers were fast, and they were many. In an instant, the creatures were upon them. Clawed limbs punctured organs, while rotting black teeth ripped flesh from bone. Panic erupted. Survivors scrambled back into their cars, desperate to escape, but there was no way out. Vehicles collided in the chaos, blocking any path to retreat, crushing the wounded and the dead beneath their tires. A man wielding a chainsaw hacked into the torso of one of the creatures, sending a red mist spraying into the air. It was pure chaos. One of the things lunged at a young man, screeching as it came. A single shot from his .38 brought it down, but it continued crawling, cackling as it dragged itself forward. Gripping a baseball bat tightly, he stepped forward and swung with all his strength. Again and again, he brought the bat down on the thing's head until his father pulled him back. By then, the fighting had stopped. His arms were flecked with blood, and the creature beneath him twitched violently in its final moments. But there was no time to catch their breath. A piercing scream rang out from one of the survivors. In her hands she held a set of the creature's supposed horns, now revealed to be nothing more than part of a crude, woven headdress. The clawed hands were merely sharpened sticks tied to forearms. Some of the first casualties had fallen not to supernatural beasts, but to well-aimed, deadly thrown rocks. As the bodies were examined, a grim realization set in. These weren't monsters born from the cursed woods. They were the people who had tried to leave town in the past weeks. Both sides had suffered heavy losses that night. Friends, neighbors, people they had known all their lives, but there was no time to grieve. In a daze, the survivors set to work, clearing the wreckage of abandoned cars and covering the dead as best they could. Bloodied and shaken, with the wounded lying in the backs of pickup trucks, they had no choice but to turn around. Back into town. Back into the nightmare they had fought so desperately to escape. When they arrived, the town was a ghostly husk, eerily empty. Not a soul in sight. The convoy trailed behind the sheriff's vehicle, unwilling to split up. No one dared to go anywhere alone. Some followed him inside the station, while others waited in their cars under the watchful eyes of armed guards. Inside, the sheriff unlocked the armory, ordering his deputies to distribute weapons and ammunition to those who needed them. Medics tended to the wounded, but as they did, fresh grief washed over the survivors. Many of the injured had not survived the journey back. Then, one by one, people realized their phones had no signal. A ripple of panic spread among them, their last hopes thinning. But the sheriff was quick to reassure them. The department had a satellite phone, a guaranteed lifeline. All eyes watched as he made the call. The line, which should have been clear, was filled with a deafening distortion. He had to repeat himself over and over, shouting into the receiver. He reported that they were completely cut off and that they needed immediate air evacuations. The survivors clung to every word, desperate to hear the response from the other end. But the voice on the line didn't seem to grasp the true severity of the situation. They needed the National Guard, but that would take 24 hours. An air ambulance could arrive within an hour, but it wouldn't be nearly enough. In the end, the best they could do was send 3 helicopters, making 2 trips, one within the next few hours and the other at dawn. It was decided that the women, children, and wounded would be the first to be airlifted out. The rest would have to survive until morning. An eerie silence settled over them as they waited for the helicopters. Normally, the late summer nights in Arkansas were filled with the chirping of crickets, but not this time. The absence of wildlife was unsettling. Huddled together, tense and fearful, they all felt like prey. Among the survivors, a father and son argued in hushed voices. The father insisted that his son board the first helicopter, but the young man refused. There was no way he would abandon him. He reminded his father that he was no longer a child. Expecting anger, he was instead met with something far worse. "It's not that, Alex," the father said, his voice heavy with sorrow. I just can't watch you die here." The weight of that statement was unbearable. They were trapped in a nightmare, where the last thing they might see was the violent death of a loved one. Yet, despite the terror of it all, the son still refused to leave his father's side. Before the argument could continue, the entire room fell silent. All eyes turned toward a figure emerging from the jail cells, a man they never expected to see again. It was Ed Harland. The sheriff followed him out, removing his handcuffs in front of the wary crowd. A nervous voice broke the silence. "Good to see they let you out, Ed." Ed didn't respond. He simply nodded, his heavy hunting boots echoing in the quiet as he strode toward the open gun locker. Without hesitation, he grabbed a 12-gauge shotgun and began loading shells. Someone spoke again, hesitant. "We're sorry about your buddies." Ed paused for a brief moment before looking up. There was nothing in his eyes, just emptiness, as if part of his soul had been left behind in the woods the day he walked back into town without a word. Without responding, he stepped outside onto the concrete steps of the sheriff's office, pausing only to take a pack of cigarettes from another man's shirt pocket. He lit one up, the glow of the ember illuminating his vacant expression as he stared into the darkness, the loaded shotgun resting on his shoulder. For the rest of the night, Ed Harland didn't say another word. Then, finally, a sound broke the silence of the distant thrum of rotor blades. "They're here! Thank God, they're here!" someone cried. The survivors rushed outside, their eyes fixed on the blinking red and white lights approaching from the night sky. A deputy fired a flare gun at the corner of a nearby intersection, casting an eerie orange glow over the landing zone. One by one, the helicopters descended, their downdraft kicking up clouds of dust and debris. The wounded were loaded first, their screams barely audible over the roar of the engines. Men embraced their wives and children, some breaking down in tears, uncertain if they would ever see them again. And then, just as quickly as they had arrived, the helicopters disappeared into the night. Only 11 people remained, less than a dozen compared to the hundreds that had once lived in the town just a week before. As the survivors exchanged fearful glances, a terrible realization dawned upon one of them. The ambush at the convoy had been preceded by the roaring of chainsaws and the clacking of axes splitting wood. The noise had drawn those savage creatures from the depths of the forest. If something as simple as a chainsaw could summon them, what horrors would 3 helicopters attract in the dead of night? Determined to survive, they set to work. The small county sheriff's office was transformed into a fortress. Every table and chair they could find was smashed up, the wood repurposed to barricade the windows. Outside, torch beams cut through the darkness, crisscrossing the building as armed men kept watch over the tree line, shotguns at the ready. From a crack in one of the boarded-up windows, a young man peered out, listening as the sheriff approached his father. "Can the boy shoot?" He fired a .22 over at his grandpa's house. Nothing bigger. The sheriff's voice was firm. "Every man here needs to be armed, Steve." Steve took a deep breath, his voice tight with concern. "I know that's not no. I get it," he replied. "I'll give him my .38, but it kicks like a mule." That response was unexpected. "I'll have one of the deputies give him his 9mm, the sheriff said. "Should be enough for him to handle." Alex should have felt a sense of pride that his father believed he was ready for such responsibility, that in the midst of a crisis he was trusted enough to help. Yet the realization only filled him with dread. If he was being given a firearm to defend himself, then things had already spiraled into something truly terrifying. It was around that moment that something strange happened outside. One of the flashlights began to flicker. The man holding it gave it a few shakes and smacked the end with his palm, but it did no good. The light went out completely, and Alex saw the man's expression shift from confusion to unease. Another man went to his truck to grab a spare battery only for his own flashlight to die in his hands. Then another failed, and another, until one by one, every flashlight outside the station flickered and faded into darkness. Alex's stomach twisted. "Dad," he said quietly, "something's happening." The words had barely left his lips before the entire sheriff's department was plunged into darkness. The overhead lights cut out, leaving them blind for a long, dreadful moment before the dim flicker of lighters sparked to life. "What the hell?" someone muttered. "Power's out all over town," one of the deputies said, his voice unsteady. "I don't know. Just be ready." But nothing could have prepared them for what emerged from the woods that night. From deep in the tree line, an eerie crimson glow began to seep through the trees, casting the entire area in a sickly red light. And then they saw 4 figures moving slowly toward the station. They made no sound, just stood at the edge of the woods, motionless silhouettes staring at them. It was Ed Harland who broke the silence. "Is that you, Henry?" One of the figures shifted slightly. "Jesus Christ," someone whispered. "No wonder we couldn't find the bodies." The sheriff rushed forward, grabbing Ed and yanking him back inside before he could do something reckless. Ed had been locked up for over a week for the murder of his friends. And yet, there they were. But something was wrong. Something was different about them. Once Ed was secured inside, they locked the door and began barricading it with furniture, bracing for the attack they knew was coming. When it came, it was worse than any of them could have imagined. With only the dim red glow bleeding through the cracks in the boarded-up windows, the deputies hurried to retrieve oil lanterns from the storage room. When the lanterns were finally lit, their flickering light illuminated something in the corner of the reception area, something that hadn't been there before. It was a hole, or rather, one large hole in the floor, surrounded by many smaller ones, as if something had recently bored through the wood. A man edged toward the deep, dark opening in the floor, his voice tense with curiosity. "What the hell?" "Stay away from that thing," another hissed, but the warning went unheeded. Without warning, a monstrous black-legged creature, something that could only be described as an enormous tick, scuttled out from the cavity, moving with horrifying speed. The curious man barely had time to react before it lunged at him. He raised his shotgun, but the creature was too fast. It scrambled up the weapon, its legs clicking against the steel, then struck, sinking its mandibles deep into the soft flesh of his neck. He opened his mouth to scream, but only a wet gurgle escaped. For a moment, everyone could only stare in horror as the parasite's grotesque blood sac swollen and darkened, filling with the dying man's blood. No one knew who fired the shot that obliterated the tick in an explosion of black gore. It hardly mattered. The man had already succumbed, his face peppered with stray pellets from the blast. A second later, another shot rang out, fired down what was now unmistakably a tunnel. "Someone cover that thing up, for Christ's sake," the sheriff barked. Acting fast, the others flipped a table and shoved it over the hole, sealing it temporarily. But they all knew it was only a temporary solution to a much greater threat. Hey, something's outside," someone shouted. "Are you one of the missing hunters?" another voice asked. "No, it isn't like what attacked the cars either. This thing's fast, real fast." "Jesus Christ," a man cried out. "I saw it too. What in God's name is that thing?" The room suddenly filled with the screeching sound of heavy furniture scraping against the floor. Terrified voices rang out, but the chaos wasn't coming from an outside force. It was Ed Harland. He was tearing down the barricade, unlocking the front door. "Hey, Ed! What the hell do you think you're doing?" Ed didn't answer. he simply stepped through the doorway and disappeared into the night. "Goddamn coward!" someone spat as the others scrambled to replace the barricade, fearing whatever lurked outside might seize the moment to strike. But nothing came. The unseen terror outside didn't even attempt to break in. If anything, Ed's sudden flight had given the survivors a fleeting distraction. Their luck, however, was short-lived. A minute later, something slammed into the boarded-up windows at the rear of the sheriff's office. One of the men jammed the barrel of his shotgun through the shattered opening and fired blindly into the night. A monstrous howl of pain followed. Then, above them, the sound of heavy, deliberate thuds echoed across the rooftop. Something massive, something inhuman, was moving up there. A thick silence fell over the room, everyone holding their breath, waiting for whatever was above to strike. And then it did. The roof exploded inward in a storm of masonry and splintered wood. Even before the dust had cleared, everyone could make out the hulking bipedal beast that now stood before them. It turned its grotesque avian face toward the group, its black eyes locking onto them. The screech that followed was so deafening, so unnatural, that the sheer force of it sent some dropping to their knees, clutching their heads as nightmarish images of rot and decay flashed through their minds. Then, as quickly as the torment had begun, it was over. When their vision returned, the beast lay sprawled on the floor, torn apart by a barrage of shotgun blasts. But whatever dark force had animated the creature wasn't completely extinguished. Its massive frame twitched and fractured, splitting apart before their eyes. The thing's severed limbs writhed independently, as if guided by some unseen force. The horror deepened as the dismembered parts began to move, sniffing the air before dragging themselves hungrily toward the survivors. Another shotgun blast rang out, followed by panicked screams. The monstrous remains twitched one final time, then fell still. A moment later, another roar filled the night, not from a creature, but from an engine. The sound of a pickup truck tearing down Main Street sent a new wave of confusion through the survivors. The vehicle sped past the sheriff's department and straight toward the ominous, glowing red tree line. Music blared from the open windows, the tune eerily familiar. "That's Ed Harland! Is he out of his goddamn mind?" Someone exclaimed. The truck skidded to a halt just before crashing into the trees. A second later, Ed emerged, yanking a tarp from the truck bed to reveal his cargo, gas canisters. At least 24 of them were crammed into the back. One by one, he began unscrewing the caps, dumping the volatile liquid into the tree line. "Jesus Christ! If he sets that fire before rescue arrives, the choppers won't be able to land through the smoke. Goddamn idiot!" a deputy cursed. But no one moved to stop him. They just watched as Ed worked, the sharp stench of gasoline filling the air. The night had already become a waking nightmare, and whatever was lurking beyond the trees, whatever had turned the roadblock into a slaughter, was something far worse than death itself. Just as the last remnants of hope were being consumed by the horror that surrounded them, the distant thrum of rotor blades suddenly cut through the night. Rescue had finally arrived. It was almost over. Weapons at the ready, the survivors rushed out of the sheriff's office. The powerful spotlights from the helicopters illuminated the nearby intersection as they prepared to land. All around, shadowy figures lurked, waiting for one last chance to strike. Gunfire echoed through the night as men fired at the shifting horrors, desperately holding them back as they scrambled into the safety of the choppers. Even as the aircraft lifted off, the gunfire continued sporadic bursts of resistance from those too shaken to stop fighting. From the sky, one of the survivors watched as Ed Harland finished splashing the last of his gasoline among the trees. The same 4 figures from before had reappeared beside him, their presence eerily still. Ed stopped, staring at them for a long moment. Then, as the helicopter carrying the survivors lifted higher into the night, the woods below erupted into a massive inferno. A fireball roared through the treetops, consuming everything in its path. The flames spread with terrifying speed, engulfing Ed Harland and the 4 hunters who had been lost. The blaze tore through the dry foliage, leaping from pine to pine until it reached the outskirts of town, where it began to devour the buildings at the edge of the community. Tree after tree collapsed into the inferno, and as the flames raged, it seemed as if the very woods themselves were screaming. A solemn, tear-filled gaze remained fixed on the destruction below, watching as everything familiar, everything that had ever been home, was reduced to ashes. It was only then that the realization struck. From the stereo system of Ed's battered old pickup truck, one last song played over the chaos. It was an old Hank Williams tune.
I'll gas up my hot rod stoker. We'll get hotter than a poker. You may be broke, but I'll be a broker. Tonight we're setting the woods on fire.